Paul would state in Romans 15 and verse 4 that whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. The Old Testament, he's saying, was written so that we can learn. There are principles that are found therein that will help us and aid us in our life. And so this afternoon I would like to direct your attention to the Old Testament, a passage that is a very beautiful passage in many respects. In Numbers, the 23rd chapter and verse 10. When it records, "Who can count the dust of Jacob, and the number of the fourth part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his." This statement was made by the prophet Balaam. We don't really want to center upon the prophet himself too much, because while he makes a very valid, good statement that we can learn from, in reality, he makes this statement in the realm of compromise, which that should be a good lesson as well. But Balak, the king, had hired him to come to curse Israel. And at first he refuses to go as he was supposed to, but he finally is persuaded to go. But he's only going to speak what God says. And so now then, that is kind of the background as to this statement, because he's built this burnt offering, and there's this sacrifice that he makes. And he takes up a parable relating to Israel and about Balak. And he blesses Israel instead of cursing them like Balak wanted to. And at the end of this that he is stating is this phrase, "Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his." Balaam did not continue in that faithfulness to God. If he really wanted to be doing what God had said, he never would have been there. But he was. And while he initially gives and blesses Israel, he also gives Balak the key to having God destroy them. And so his life, his character, were the very opposite of what he states here, and his desired expression, that let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his. The statement is, as we mentioned, true, and there are some lessons that we need to learn in regards to it. The first is the fact that all men must die. There's no doubt in Balaam's mind but that one day he's going to die. Otherwise, this statement that he makes no sense. He knows he's going to die. But isn't that true with all of us? Don't we all realize that we're going to die? Now, as we grow older and the gray hairs get more, and some lose all of their hair, and the wrinkles start appearing, and all of that, as we grow older, we recognize death a little bit more as far as our life is concerned. When we're younger, though, and we're full of vitality, and we think about this world and the things of this world, and we don't think about death. That's something else. It doesn't even enter into our thinking. In 2 Samuel 14 and verse 14, though, it records, "For we must needs die. And are as water spilt upon the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Neither doth God respect any person, yet doth he devise means that his banished be not expelled from him." That statement, "we must needs die," is a recognition that we're not going to live on this earth all through the existence of this world. We have a need to die. Our growing older proves such to each and every one of us. And so, Solomon would state in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 5, "For the living know that they shall die. But the dead know not anything, neither have they any more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten," he says. The living, you and I who are living alive today, we know that we're going to die. We don't know when, obviously, but we know that there is an appointment, as Hebrews 9:27 puts it, "is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." There's that appointment we're going to keep with death. We don't know when. It might be 20, 30, 40 years in the future, or as was expressed in the prayer, we might not even make it through the day. Our next breath is not really guaranteed to us. We're going to die. And with the frailty of life, the possibility, as James would express it, that our life is but a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. It's a little time here upon this earth. The frailty of life. If this day were your last, if it was my last, what would my desire be? What would your desire be? Would it not be as Balaam's, "Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his"? Wouldn't that be the desire of everyone who breathes their last breath in this world? That they want to die the death of the righteous. But this expression also shows unto us that we either die the death of the righteous or we die the death of the unrighteous. Balaam knew this when he said this. We're either righteous and we die that way, or we're unrighteous and we die that way. Sometimes it seems like, though, we start living our lives and we forget that fact. That there are but two classes of people. A lot of times we try and kind of have a shade of meaning or a shade of definition from one to the other. But there's two classes of people and only two classes. And it's not Democrats and Republicans. It's not going to be based on the color of a person's skin or the hair color or whether they're male or female. None of those things are going to matter. The two classes of people are either the righteous or the unrighteous. Jesus expressed it in Matthew 7:13 and 14. "Enter ye in at the strait gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth unto destruction, and many there be that go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way that leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." Jesus expresses there's one of two ways, as far as pathways in which you live, and then as far as gates. There's the broad way that leads to destruction. There's the narrow way that leads unto life. That's the only two ways in which there is. There is no other. In Colossians, the 1st chapter, Paul would state, starting in verse 12, giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in life, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. He sets forth two kingdoms for us. There's the kingdom of darkness, which he refers to as the power of darkness, and the kingdom of his dear Son, the kingdom of Christ. Those are the only two kingdoms that exist. We are either good or we are evil. We're either in the kingdom of God or we're in the kingdom of Satan. We're either on that narrow way to life or we're on that broad way to destruction. There is no in between. I realize that the Roman Catholic Church comes along and tries to make a middle ground there, a purgatory, which can't be found in the Scriptures anywhere, neither the word nor the concept. But it's an attempt to try and get people into middle ground someplace that doesn't exist. In the wars that we've seen in the past, many nations will try at times to take a neutral stance. We're not for either side. Well, that's not the way it works with God, and not the way it works as far as spirituality is concerned. Jesus would express the idea, you're either with me or you're against me. You're either gathering with me or you're scattering abroad. There is, and that middle ground just doesn't exist. John would express it in 1 John 5 and verse 19. We know that we are of God, and the whole world lieth in wickedness. What we do, though, we start looking around at our denominational friends and other friends that maybe not even religious. And, well, they live a good life. They're good people. They're morally upright. They'd give you the shirt off their back. And we have all of these expressions, and we fail to realize they're in wickedness. They are on the pathway to destruction. They are on Satan's side. They're not on God's side. Every one of these religious groups that are around us are on Satan's side. They're the servants of Satan. They're not the servants of God. There's only the church which belongs to Christ, the church of Christ. That's the way in which is on that of God. Everyone else lieth in wickedness, the whole world. And we need to realize that, we sometimes talk about the lack of evangelism within the church. I think, and this is my personal opinion, but I think a lot of times it's because we've gotten the idea that these people in the denominational world and that these people who live a good moral life, that somehow God's going to work a way in which they can be saved. We don't realize they're in wickedness, they're in sin, they are of Satan, they're supporting Satan, they're doing everything that Satan wants. And they're going to spend an eternity in hell. Now, Balaam knew that there's just those two classes. Let me die the death of the righteous. He knew that there was the righteous and the unrighteous, and that's all that there was to it. There is no middle ground. And he had the desire to die the death of the righteous. Now, as we consider those matters and the two classes that are there, it's not going to matter how we classify ourselves. We need to examine ourselves whether we are in the faith. Prove your own selves, Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. But the more important aspect is, how would God classify us? What does God consider as sin? Which one of those groups, the righteous or the unrighteous? Which group is God going to play? I might think that I'm in the righteous group, that I'm walking that narrow pathway unto life. But God says, no, you're not. God's decision is the one that counts, not mine. I'm not going to be judged by my ideas and my thoughts and my wishes, but by what God says. And so we've got to study to make sure that we are truly what God classifies us as. I can look in, and that's the idea of 1 Corinthians 13th chapter, when he's talking about the complete revelation of God's will, that I can see into that mirror clearly, distinctly now, and see myself as God sees me. It's not talking about being able to see God face to face in that passage. It's talking about looking at ourselves and seeing our reflection in the Scriptures. I can go to the Scriptures and see how God views me. I'm looking into that mirror darkly. That was at that time and during that period of incompletion, because they didn't have the complete revelation. But now then that we have the complete revelation, that darkness is taken away, and I can see clearly how God sees me, how God classifies me. And so James again would also talk about looking into the perfect law of liberty and our need to continue therein. Well, that is, we can look into God's Word and we can see what we must do in order to be pleasing to God, and thus be in that narrow way to life. Because there's only those two choices. But then the ends of those are quite different. They're vastly different. There in Matthew 7, 13 and 14 again, when Jesus talks about entering in at the strait gate, wide's the gate, broad's the way that leadeth unto what? Destruction. As opposed to the strait gate and the narrow way which leads unto life. Two vastly different ends. In Matthew the 25th chapter, at the end of that chapter, starting in verse 31 and going through verse 46, Jesus gives us a scene of the judgment in which he is passing sentence upon the two groups of individuals. He makes a separation of those two groups, those on the right hand, those on the left hand. Those on the right hand, he tells them to enter into the joys of the Lord. Those on the left hand, he tells them to depart from me. And he says in verse 46, first concerning those that he has placed on the left hand, he says, depart from me, these shall go away into everlasting punishment. Then he turns to the other group, but the righteous unto life eternal. There's the two ends based upon the two classes or two groups of individuals. The righteous into life eternal. The unrighteous, everyone else, into everlasting punishment. Balaam implies this idea even in the statement that he makes in his desire, let me die the death of the righteous. Why? Because he knew the end of the righteous and the end of the wicked. That the righteous is going to be blessed, the wicked is going to be punished. He knew the principle that is set forth there. And so the righteous have an outlook of that beautiful place called heaven. That we have that opportunity to come before God and live that way, and we can then spend an eternity with Him in praise and adoration to our Creator. It should be strange that people who don't really enjoy coming together to worship God, how do they think they're going to even enjoy heaven? It would be a miserable thing to those individuals if they made it to heaven, which they're not anyway. But if they were in heaven, an eternity of doing what we're doing right here. And if they don't enjoy doing it right here, right now, then how do they think they're going to have any joy in heaven, doing it throughout all eternity? They're not going to enjoy heaven, even if they should make it. To be able to be with God, to worship Him, to praise and give glory unto our Creator throughout all eternity. Yes, we can talk about the beauties of heaven as well. Heaven is a beautiful place. In 1 Peter, when Peter describes it, and we read it this morning, how it's an inheritance that is incorruptible, undefiled, that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you. It's interesting to me that Peter uses negative terms to describe heaven. We would think you'd want something positive, something glowing, but he doesn't. He uses negative terms. And I believe the reason for that is because heaven is so beautiful, so glorious, that there's nothing that can compare with it in the very thoughts of man. And so the only thing that he can do is to draw a contrast to what we're familiar with, things that corrupt, things that decay, things that are sinful, things that lose its beauty. Those are the things we associate with. Those are the things that we know. And so he says, it's not like that. It's not like what you know, because it's so beautiful and so glorious, there's no way to describe it and you even understand it. That's the idea that Peter is trying to express by using all negatives in describing that beautiful place. That it is such a place of indescribable beauty that there is absolutely nothing in your mind that can even comprehend it. It should make us want and have the desire to go there. On the other hand, the unrighteous, their end, well, it's hell. And a lot of times that phrase is used a great deal in our society, and we apply it to things that are bad and evil. But there's no comparison with anything in this world as far as the torment and the punishment and the evil of hell. And so God describes it as, in various terms, it is the blackness of darkness, for example. You ever wake up and it is totally, completely dark, with absolutely no light whatsoever? You cannot see anything. You can't even see a hand in front of your face. You can't see anything. There's an eerie feeling that we get when it starts getting dark like that. We don't like it. And yet, hell is really the absence of light, because God is light. And they're separated from God. So there is absolute, total darkness that they are in. It's described as a fire, an everlasting fire. I don't know if there's anything here upon this earth that causes greater pain than a burn. Burns are horrible. But yet here is an eternal burning, an eternal fire that does not cease, the anguish and the torment. And that's, so God uses those terms, anguish. The rich man was in anguish. He was in torments. Those are terms that God uses to describe the utter pain and torment and of this place called hell. We look at God and we consider all of those wonderful attributes of God. in 2 Thessalonians 1, it says that we are separated from God, separated from His presence. That means everything that God is, and all of those attributes of God, that in hell, none of them exist. God is love, so there's no love in heaven or in hell. God is gracious. There's no grace in hell. And you can go on with all of the attributes of God, and because they are separated from God, they are separated from that attribute that God has and that God is. No wonder it is a place in which man should try to avoid. And Balaam, by his statement, he's saying, I don't want that type of an end. But the problem was that Balaam didn't live the type of life to die as one who is righteous. Only those who live as righteous can die righteous. In 1 John 3 and verse 7, John says, Little children, let no man deceive you. He that doeth righteousness is righteous, even as he is righteous. We see one of the attributes of God, His characteristics, is that of righteousness or justness. But He makes the application, if we want to be that, if we want to have that characteristic, we're going to have to do righteousness in order to have that characteristic of being righteous as God is righteous. Well, what do we mean when we say righteousness then? If we have to do righteousness, how do we determine what righteousness is? Well, God does that for us. For example, in 119th Psalm in verse 172, the psalmist says, My tongue shall speak of thy word, for all thy commandments are righteousness. And so we learn that lesson now. God's commands are righteousness. Now then, we take that back to what John says there in 1 John 3 and verse 7, that he that doeth righteousness is righteous. So in order to be righteous, I've got to do all of God's commands. Now, that's not really all that difficult to understand. When I do all of God's commands, then I'm righteous as God is righteous. Paul would describe it in Romans 1:16 and 17 when he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein refers back to the gospel of Christ. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. The righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now then, take that back to, again, what John says there in 1 John 3 and verse 7, He that doeth righteousness, that is, he that doeth that which is revealed in the gospel of Jesus Christ, he that does those things is righteous, even as God is righteous. God is making known His righteousness through that gospel. And when we do the gospel, when we are obedient to it, then we're righteous as God is righteous. That's how we are to become righteous. The first psalm, beautiful psalm that sets forth these two ways in reality. The blessed man as opposed to the man who's not blessed. The blessed man is first the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in His law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. And his leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but they are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Two classes of individuals with two ends. And he says that one who is righteous, he describes what he does not do, what he does do. What he does not do in verse 1, he doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of the scornful. So that's what he does not do. The righteous man, on the other hand, does find his delight in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate. So the first two verses has what the righteous man does. Verse 3 shows the blessedness of that righteous life. He shall be like a tree that's planted by the rivers of water. That's a tree that's not going to be dying out. It's going to grow up. And he brings out the fact that his brings forth fruit in his season. Leaf is not going to wither. Whatever he does is going to prosper. Well, that's the righteous man. That's the end result. That's what happens to the righteous man within his life, and then that eternal aspect, that the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous. The ungodly, though, there's that other class. Really, they're the opposite of the righteous. Ungodly are not so. That's not the way it is with the ungodly. Instead, they're like the chaff that the wind drives away. There's no stability, no strength. They're just flowing in any and every way. They're good for nothing except to be gathered up and be cast into the fire. And so he says, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment. They're not going to be there. They're not going to be going into that heaven's home. That place of eternity in hell is waiting them. Lord knows the way of the righteous. Yes, it's that individual who is obedient to his will, who does all of his commandments, who obeys the gospel of Jesus Christ. Way of ungodly, though, everyone else, that one who does not obey the gospel, that one who does not do all of God's commands, the ungodly, they're going to perish. Galatians 6, chapter verse 7 and verse 8, we're warned, be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, now stop there for just a second. Whatsoever a man soweth, that is the life that he is living here upon this earth. That path that he has chosen to live, whether of the righteous or the unrighteous. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And so he shows now the two classifications. He that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. There's the two ends, corruption or life everlasting. Heaven or hell. The choice is ours, though, as to the choices that we make to live, as to whether we obey all of God's commands, we obey the gospel of Jesus Christ as revealed within the pages of the New Testament, or whether we fail to. And if we fail to, then an eternal torment is waiting. Only by living faithful to what God says, His revealed will heaven be our home. What state are you in this afternoon? If death should claim you today, where would you spend your eternity? Would you be dying the death of the righteous? Or would you be dying the death of the unrighteous? Surely all of our desires, because we're here this afternoon, should be and is, let me die the death of the righteous. Let my last end be like his. But in order to die the death of the righteous, we must live the life of the righteous. If you haven't lived that way, then change your life this afternoon. Make things right with God, and accept the hope that we have of an eternity with God in heaven by living that life of the righteous. Walking in that path that's narrow path, yes, straight way that leads to life eternal. If we can help you and assist you in doing that, and why not come as we stand and sing the invitation song?